I have often wondered, in the quiet years that followed, why one particular adventure remained so vivid in my memory. Of all the strange cases I witnessed beside Sherlock Holmes, there were many that possessed greater danger. Some involved murder. Others threatened the security of governments or exposed the darkest corners of human nature. Yet, whenever my thoughts drift back across the decades, they return unfailingly to a spring evening in Baker Street and to a woman whom Holmes himself never quite forgot. To Sherlock Holmes, she was always the woman. He rarely spoke her name. When he did, there was no trace of sentiment in his voice. Indeed, sentiment was a thing he regarded with profound suspicion. Strong emotions, especially those associated with affection or romance, were obstacles in his view, unwelcome disturbances that clouded judgment and weakened reason. Holmes admired facts. He trusted logic. He believed that a mind worked best when untouched by passion. For that reason, many people who met him considered him cold. They were mistaken. Holmes was not cold. He simply reserved his deepest feelings for matters that most men overlooked: truth, justice, intellectual beauty, and the pursuit of knowledge. Those things stirred him more deeply than any ordinary human attachment ever could. Yet there was one exception, one woman whose memory lingered in his thoughts long after the case had ended. Her name was Irene Adler, and this is the story of how she defeated the greatest detective in Europe. But before I tell you of her, I must first take you back to the beginning. At that time, my own life had changed considerably. My marriage had drawn me away from Baker Street. No longer did I occupy the familiar rooms at 221B. Instead, I devoted myself to my medical practice and to the quiet happiness of domestic life. Those who have experienced newly married contentment will understand. The days seemed to pass swiftly. Patients came and went. Responsibilities multiplied. Weeks often slipped by before I realized how much time had passed. As a result, I saw very little of Holmes. Now and then I would read a brief newspaper report concerning one of his exploits, a mysterious affair in Eastern Europe, an investigation conducted on behalf of royalty, a baffling crime solved after the official police had abandoned hope. His name appeared occasionally in small columns tucked away near the back pages, though never with the recognition he truly deserved. Holmes cared little for fame. The solution itself was his reward. When I pictured him during those months, I imagined him much as I had always known him, seated beside the fire in Baker Street, violin within reach, chemical apparatus scattered across the table, and unanswered correspondence piled in precarious stacks around the room. He lived between extremes. There were periods when he seemed almost dormant, spending long hours in contemplation. Then suddenly some new problem would appear, and every faculty of his remarkable mind would awaken at once. He became transformed. His eyes would brighten. His posture would sharpen. The entire man seemed charged with purpose. No hunting hound ever followed a scent with greater intensity. It was during one such period that fate brought me once more to Baker Street. The date was the 20th of March, 1888. I had spent the day tending a patient in another district of London and was returning home after dusk. The evening was cool. Light mist drifted through the streets. Gas lamps glowed softly against the gathering darkness. Quite by chance, my route carried me along Baker Street. As I approached the familiar building, I slowed my pace. The sight of that doorway awakened countless memories. How many adventures had begun there? How many nights had Holmes and I sat discussing impossible mysteries while rain rattled against the windows? I found myself standing across the street, gazing upward. The sitting room windows were brightly illuminated. A tall shadow moved across the blind, then back again, then once more. I recognized the figure instantly. Holmes. He was pacing. Even from outside, I knew what that meant. His head was lowered, his hands clasped behind his back. His movements were swift and purposeful. He was working. Some new problem had seized his imagination. The old excitement stirred within me immediately. Without allowing myself time for further reflection, I crossed the street and rang the bell. Moments later, I found myself climbing the familiar 17 steps. Mrs. Hudson greeted me warmly and showed me upstairs. When I entered the sitting room, Holmes was standing before the fire. He turned. For an instant, the severity of his expression softened. Though he was never demonstrative, I believe he was genuinely pleased to see me. Without a word, he gestured toward my old armchair. A box of cigars appeared on the table beside me. He pointed toward the drinks cabinet. Then he resumed his position before the fire and studied me in silence. No one observed quite like Sherlock Holmes. His gaze moved over me slowly, deliberately, examining details invisible to everyone else. At last, a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Marriage suits you, Watson," he said. And thus began one of the most extraordinary adventures of our lives. Far beyond London, powerful forces were already in motion. A king was growing desperate. A woman held a secret capable of shaking Europe. And before the night was over, a mysterious visitor would arrive at Baker Street wearing a mask. The game, though neither Holmes nor I fully realized it yet, was about to begin. For a few moments after his greeting, Sherlock Holmes continued to examine me in silence. The fire crackled softly between us. Outside, the distant sounds of London drifted through the evening mist, muted and far away. Within the familiar sitting room of Baker Street, everything felt wonderfully unchanged. The shelves remained crowded with books and papers. Chemical equipment occupying nearly every available surface. His violin rested in its customary place near the window. Even the air carried the faint scent of tobacco that seemed permanently woven into the fabric of the room. Holmes folded his long arms and regarded me with amusement. "Marriage suits you, Watson," he repeated. "I should estimate that you have gained 7.5 pounds since I last saw you." I laughed. 7 pounds exactly. Ah, then I was only half a pound in error. You astonish me, as always. It is hardly astonishing. To you, perhaps. His eyes twinkled. You have also returned to regular medical practice. I stared. Now, really, Holmes, no one informed you of that. No one needed to. And yet you know, I observe. I shook my head. Sometimes I suspect you possess supernatural powers. Nothing supernatural, my dear Watson. Merely observation. I settled back into the chair and explain it. Gladly, he lit a cigarette and stretched comfortably before the fire. Your left shoe provides the first clue. My shoe? Precisely. I looked down. It appeared perfectly ordinary. Holmes smiled at my confusion. On the inside edge of the sole, there are several small scratches. Someone has attempted to scrape dried mud from the leather with a knife. I bent forward. To my astonishment, he was correct. Tiny marks were indeed visible. They were made by your servant, Holmes continued, and made carelessly. I laughed. Mary Jane again. Then I am correct. Entirely. Naturally. A careful servant would not have damaged the leather. He leaned forward. The mud itself tells a story. It was thick country mud rather than ordinary London dirt. Therefore, you recently walked in the countryside during poor weather. That happened last Thursday. Excellent. I could only shake my head in admiration. And my medical practice? Holmes pointed toward me. You carry the faint odor of iodoform. I glanced at my sleeves. I suppose that is true. Furthermore, there is a small stain of silver nitrate upon your right forefinger. I examined my hand and found it exactly where he indicated. Finally, your hat. My hat. The bulge along one side suggests that you frequently conceal a stethoscope there while traveling between patients. I burst out laughing. When you explain it, everything seems ridiculously simple. Because it is simple. No, Holmes, it only becomes simple after you reveal the answer. He smiled. That, Watson, is the difference between seeing and observing. The remark was typical of him. Holmes possessed an extraordinary ability to notice details that everyone else overlooked. Indeed, he often claimed that most people moved through life half blind. They looked without truly seeing. They noticed without truly understanding. To illustrate his point, he suddenly asked, "How many steps lead from the hallway to this room?" I blinked. "I have no idea." "You have climbed them hundreds of times." "Certainly. Yet you cannot tell me the number." I considered the matter. "No, there are 17. 17. Exactly." He tapped his cigarette against the ashtray. "You have seen them countless times, Watson. I have observed them." I laughed once more. Even after years beside him, Holmes could still make me feel like a schoolboy. For a time we spoke of old cases and mutual acquaintances. The conversation wandered comfortably through familiar territory until Holmes reached for a sheet of pink paper lying upon the table beside him. "Speaking of observation," he said, "perhaps you would care to examine this." He handed it across. The paper was unusually thick and tinted a pale rose color. At first glance, it appeared expensive. More importantly, it contained neither date nor signature. I adjusted my position near the lamp and began to read aloud. "There will call upon you tonight at 7:45, a gentleman who desires to consult you upon a matter of the deepest importance." Holmes listened with closed eyes. I continued, "Your recent services to one of the royal houses of Europe have shown that you may safely be trusted with matters of great delicacy." The message proceeded in the same formal tone. The writer requested absolute discretion. The visitor, it explained, might wear a mask. When I finished reading, I looked up. An unusual letter. Very. "What do you make of it?" Holmes steepled his fingers. "What do you make of it?" I examined the paper again. "It appears expensive." "Good. The writer is likely wealthy." "Excellent." Encouraged, I continued, "The quality suggests someone accustomed to luxury." Holmes nodded. "Not bad." I turned the sheet over. "There is something peculiar about the texture." "Exactly." He leaned forward. "Now hold it to the light." I did so. Almost immediately, I noticed several faint markings woven into the paper itself. A large letter E, smaller G, then a P, and finally a G, followed by a tiny T. I read them aloud. "What does it mean?" Holmes rose and crossed to his bookshelf. Fascinating question. He removed a large reference volume and began turning pages rapidly. "The answer lies not in England, but on the continent." I watched as he searched. Suddenly his finger stopped. "Here we are." He turned the book toward me. Egria. The name meant nothing to me. Holmes smiled. "A town in Bohemia." "Bohemia?" "Quite so." He tapped the paper. "The initials indicate the manufacturer. The paper originates from a mill located near Egria." "So, a writer is Bohemian?" "Not necessarily, but continue." I reread the letter. Certain phrases now sounded oddly constructed. The wording seemed unusual, foreign. Holmes noticed my expression. "You see it. The sentences are strange. German. German? The structure gives it away. He settled back into his chair. A Frenchman would not write like this. Neither would an Englishman. Then the author is German? Precisely. I stared at the mysterious pink letter. A wealthy German, writing upon Bohemian paper, arriving under cover of darkness, possibly disguised. The whole affair grew more intriguing by the minute. What do you suppose he wants? Holmes shrugged. Data, Watson. We require data. Before I could reply, a sudden sound echoed from the street below. The sharp clatter of horses' hooves, the grinding of carriage wheels against the curb, then the ringing of the front bell. Holmes crossed quickly to the window. For a brief moment he peered through the curtains. A grin appeared upon his face. Interesting. What is it? A fine carriage. How fine? Very. He glanced back at me. A pair of horses worth at least 150 guineas each. Good heavens, there is money in this case. The bell sounded again, this time more insistently. Heavy footsteps entered the hallway below. The stairs creaked beneath a considerable weight. Whoever approached was a large man. The footsteps climbed steadily higher, nearer, nearer, nearer. Then they stopped outside the sitting-room door. A moment of silence followed. The handle remained motionless. Even Holmes seemed attentive now. Then came a firm and authoritative knock. 3 measured taps. The sound echoed through the room. Holmes calmly returned to his chair. Come in. The door swung open. Framed against the light of the hallway stood one of the most imposing men I had ever seen. He towered above the doorway itself, broad-shouldered, powerfully built, dressed in garments of extraordinary richness, and across the upper half of his face he wore a black mask. At that moment, neither Holmes nor I could know that the stranger standing before us was no ordinary client. Within the next few minutes, he would reveal a secret that threatened not merely a reputation, but the future of a European kingdom. And with that revelation, the remarkable case of Irene Adler would truly begin. For several seconds after the door opened, neither Holmes nor I spoke. The stranger who entered Baker Street possessed a presence that filled the room immediately. He was a giant of a man. Even seated, he would have towered over most gentlemen. Standing in the doorway, wrapped in a magnificent blue cloak, lined with flame-colored silk, he seemed almost larger than life. His attire was rich beyond reason. Heavy bands of dark fur decorated his coat. A glittering jewel fastened the cloak at his throat. His boots, trimmed with expensive leather and fur, reached nearly to his knees. Everything about him proclaimed wealth, not English wealth, which tends toward restraint. This was continental wealth, royal wealth, or something very close to it. Most striking of all was the black mask that concealed the upper portion of his face. He paused upon the threshold and glanced from Holmes to myself. His gaze lingered on me briefly, as though uncertain whether my presence was acceptable. Holmes indicated a chair. Pray be seated. The visitor lowered himself into it, though even then he seemed too large for the furniture. His deep voice carried a distinct German accent. You received my note? Certainly. And this gentleman? My friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. The stranger frowned. The matter upon which I consult you is of the utmost delicacy. I am aware of that. I had hoped to speak privately. Holmes shook his head. What you may say to me, you may say before Dr. Watson. The man studied me for several moments. Finally, he gave a reluctant nod. Very well. His enormous shoulders rose and fell as he drew a deep breath. That before I proceed, I must obtain your promise of secrecy. You have it. For 2 years. Holmes nodded. And mine as well, I added. The visitor appeared satisfied. He leaned forward. The affair concerned one of the reigning royal houses of Europe. I noticed Holmes close his eyes. To a casual observer, he might have appeared bored. I knew better. When Holmes closed his eyes in that fashion, it often meant he was concentrating with exceptional intensity. The stranger continued. The consequences of failure could be enormous. Holmes remained silent. The matter may influence the course of European history. Still, Holmes said nothing. The visitor shifted uneasily. Perhaps he expected surprise, perhaps admiration. Instead, he received only calm attention. At last he spoke again. "You will excuse the mask." Holmes opened one eye. "Of course. The individual whom I represent wishes to remain unknown." "I understand, and the name I have given is not my real one. I am aware of that as well." The stranger blinked. For the first time uncertainty entered his expression. "You are aware of it?" "Entirely." The giant stared. I could almost hear the gears turning within his mind. He had arrived expecting to impress the famous detective. Instead, he was discovering that Holmes seemed perpetually one step ahead. The visitor cleared his throat. "The matter concerns the great house of Ormstein." Holmes remained motionless. "The hereditary kings of Bohemia." "I know." The response emerged so casually that the stranger nearly jumped. His eyes widened. "You know?" "I know." For several moments, silence filled the room. Then, with visible frustration, the man rose from his chair and began pacing. His heavy footsteps shook the floorboards. Finally, he stopped. With an abrupt movement, he tore the mask from his face and hurled it onto the carpet. "You are correct," he exclaimed. "I am the king." The declaration echoed through the room. Even though I had suspected something extraordinary, the revelation startled me. Before us stood none other than Wilhelm Gottschalk Sigismund von Ormstein, Grand Duke of Cassel-Felstein and hereditary King of Bohemia. His face was handsome but powerful, a broad forehead, strong features, a determined mouth, the expression of a man accustomed to command. Yet beneath the confidence I detected anxiety, perhaps even fear. Holmes showed neither surprise nor excitement. He merely inclined his head slightly. "Your Majesty." The king resumed his seat. For a moment he rubbed his forehead as though burdened by some invisible weight. "You understand now why I came personally?" "Perfectly. I dared not entrust the matter to another." Holmes nodded. "Then pray explain it." The king stared into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice had softened. 5 years ago, I visited Warsaw. He paused. There I became acquainted with a woman. Holmes reached lazily toward a drawer. Her name? Irene Adler. Without hesitation, Holmes turned toward me. "Watson, would you consult my index?" This was one of Holmes's more remarkable habits. Over many years, he had created a vast personal archive containing information on thousands of individuals, politicians, criminals, scientists, artists, noblemen, adventurers. If a person had achieved any degree of notoriety, Holmes usually possessed a file. I located the appropriate volume and began searching. The entry appeared quickly. "Irene Adler," I read aloud. "Born in New Jersey." Continue. "Former opera singer." Yes. "Performed at La Scala." The king nodded impatiently. "That is the woman." Holmes folded his hands. "A celebrated beauty." The king's expression darkened. "More than that." "Indeed. She possesses intelligence." The way he spoke those words caught my attention. There was respect in his voice, perhaps even admiration. Holmes noticed it too. "Go on." The king hesitated. Then he spoke plainly. "I became attached to her." "A romantic attachment?" "Yes, and she possesses evidence of it." The king's jaw tightened. Unfortunately. What sort of evidence? Letters. Holmes waved a dismissive hand. Letters can be denied. Not these. Why not? They are written in my hand. Forgery exists. The king frowned. They bear my seal. Imitations can be made. My private stationery can be stolen. The king leaned forward. There is also a photograph. Holmes became still. A photograph. Of the two of us together. For the first time that evening, Holmes appeared genuinely interested. Ah. The king nodded grimly. You understand the difficulty. I begin to. The monarch rose again and walked slowly toward the window. I was younger then. A common condition. This is no time for humor, Mr. Holmes. On the contrary, Your Majesty, humor is often useful. The king sighed. I loved her. The admission seemed painful. At least I believed I did. And now I am to be married. I exchanged a glance with Holmes. Now the danger became clearer. A political marriage? Yes. To whom? The king named a princess from one of Europe's most respected royal families. The alliance carried enormous importance. A scandal could destroy it instantly. If the photograph appears, he continued, the engagement will end. And Miss Adler threatens to reveal it? She does. On the day the engagement is publicly announced, Monday, Holmes considered. And we have 3 days, the king nodded. 3 days for disaster. For a moment only the crackling fire could be heard. Then Holmes asked the question that would change everything. Have you attempted to recover the photograph? The king laughed bitterly. 5 times, and failure every time. Holmes's eye brightened. Now, at last, the challenge had captured his imagination. Outside Baker Street, London settled quietly into the evening. Inside, however, the game had begun. Somewhere in the city lived Irene Adler, a woman clever enough to outwit kings, a woman beautiful enough to inspire obsession. And as Sherlock Holmes was about to discover, perhaps the only person capable of matching him, move for move, the hunt for the photograph was about to begin. A's was presented to him. There came a brief period during which he seemed to withdraw into himself. Facts arranged themselves within his mind. Possibilities were weighed. Contradictions were tested. I had seen the process many times before. The king's anxious face revealed that he found the silence difficult to endure. At last Holmes spoke. You have attempted to recover the photograph. The king gave a weary nod. Repeatedly. Explain. His Majesty sank deeper into his chair. Twice burglars entered her house, and they found nothing. Professional men, the best available. Holmes smiled faintly. They usually fail. The king continued. On another occasion, her luggage was intercepted while she traveled. No result? None. And the remaining attempts? She was stopped and searched. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Searched? Twice? And still nothing? Nothing? A trace of admiration appeared upon Holmes's face. Remarkable. It is maddening, the king replied. I can imagine. The monarch crossed the room and stood near the window, gazing into the darkness outside Baker Street. You do not know Irene Adler? No. She possesses extraordinary courage. Many people do. She possesses extraordinary intelligence. Fewer people do. And she never forgets an injury. Holmes folded his hands. That may prove useful. The king turned sharply. Useful? It helps explain her actions. His Majesty frowned. I do not follow. Most acts appear irrational until one discovers the motive behind them. Holmes rose and joined him at the window. You wronged her. The king looked uncomfortable. That was years ago. Yet she remembers. Apparently, Holmes nodded. Then we begin with an advantage. The king stared. An advantage? We understand why she acts. He returned calmly to his chair. Tell me, does she intend blackmail? No. Interesting. The king seemed surprised. Why do you say that? Because if she wished money, she would already have demanded it. The monarch considered this. It is true. She seeks something else. Revenge? Possibly. Holmes light another cigarette. Or perhaps protection. The king said nothing. The silence itself felt like an answer. After a moment, Holmes continued. You are certain she still possesses the photograph? Absolutely. Not a copy? The original? And she intends to send it when the engagement becomes public? Without fail. Holmes leaned back comfortably. Then we still have time. The king laughed humorlessly. You sound unconcerned. I am. Holmes, the future of my marriage may depend upon this matter. Then it is fortunate that you consulted me. For the first time that evening, the king smiled, only slightly. But the expression suggested genuine relief. What you require? Her address. Briony Lodge. The king removed a notebook and consulted it. Serpentine Avenue, St. John's Wood. Holmes wrote it down carefully. Anything else? The photograph is cabinet size. Could you believe that important? Everything is important. The king nodded slowly. I had often noticed how clients reacted to Holmes. Initially, they doubted him. Then they became curious. Eventually, they found themselves trusting him completely. His confidence had a curious effect upon people, even royalty. Now, Holmes said, one final matter. The king's expression tightened. Yes, expenses. At this, the monarch reached beneath his cloak and produced a large leather bag. It landed upon the table with a heavy thud. The sound alone suggested considerable wealth. There are 300 pounds in gold, he pointed, and 700 pounds in banknotes. I confess that I stared. 1,000 pounds was a tremendous sum in those days. The king noticed my surprise. You have complete freedom of action, Mr. Holmes. Excellent. I would give a province of my kingdom to recover that photograph. Holmes casually scribbled the receipt. Fortunately, I shall not require a province. The king laughed. When he departed shortly afterward, the atmosphere within Baker Street changed noticeably. The room seemed quieter. The strange energy accompanying royal visitors vanished with the sound of retreating carriage wheels. For a time, Holmes remained seated beside the fire. His eyes were closed. His fingertips pressed together. I recognized the posture. He was thinking. Finally, I spoke. Well? His eyes opened. Well, what? What do you think? A fascinating problem. You have a plan already. Not yet. I smiled. That means you have 3 plans already. Holmes chuckled. Perhaps. I rose and stretched. What happens next? Tomorrow morning. You intend to visit Briony Lodge? Naturally. Officially? Certainly not. His smile widened. One should never approach a problem from the direction it expects. I had learned that this usually meant disguises. Indeed, Holmes possessed an almost theatrical gift for transformation. Given the proper costume, makeup, and mannerisms, he could become almost anyone. A laborer, a sailor, a priest, a bookkeeper, a beggar. The change extended beyond clothing. His posture altered. His speech altered. Even his personality seemed transformed. What will you become? I asked. A question best answered tomorrow. Hudson informed me that he had left shortly after 8 that morning and had not returned. This did not surprise me. When engaged in a case, Holmes often vanished for hours, sometimes days. I settled into my old chair and waited. The room felt strangely nostalgic. Many memories lived within those walls. Long evenings discussing impossible mysteries, sudden midnight departures, victories celebrated with tobacco and conversation, defeats analyzed with equal enthusiasm. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself wondering about Irene Adler. Who was she, truly? An adventuress? A victim? A schemer? A woman protecting herself? The king clearly admired her, perhaps more than he realized. And Holmes, I suspected Holmes admired her already. Not romantically, never that. But intellectually. He appreciated worthy opponents. Few existed. Sudden noise interrupted my thoughts. The front door slammed. Heavy footsteps climbed the stairs. Moments later, the sitting room door burst open. I looked up, then stared. The individual entering the room appeared to be a drunken stable hand. His clothes were shabby. His face was weather-beaten. Untidy whiskers covered his cheeks. His hat sat crookedly upon his head. For several seconds I failed to recognize him. Then the man grinned. Only one person in London possessed that grin. Sherlock Holmes. He collapsed into a chair and began laughing so hard that tears appeared in his eyes. I had never seen him in such spirits. "What happened?" I asked. The question only made him laugh harder. Finally, he wiped his eyes. "My dear Watson," he managed, "if you could have seen what occurred this morning." He shook his head. "It is one of the most extraordinary experiences of my life." I leaned forward eagerly. "Tell me everything." Holmes smiled. "Oh, I intend to." Outside, evening shadows slowly gathered over London. Inside Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes was about to tell me how his investigation at Briony Lodge had led him into the path of Irene Adler herself, and into a chain of events more bizarre than either of us could have imagined. Holmes continued to chuckle as he removed the last traces of his disguise. The false whiskers disappeared. Weathered cap was tossed onto the sofa. A few moments later, the disreputable stable hand had vanished, and the Sherlock Holmes I knew so well sat opposite me once again, yet the amusement remained in his eyes. Whatever had happened that day had delighted him immensely. "Come, Holmes," I said, "you cannot leave me in suspense." "Oh, Watson," he replied, still smiling, "if ever I found myself cast unexpectedly into the middle of a comedy, today was the day." He reached for his pipe and settled comfortably into his chair. "Let us begin at the beginning." I listened attentively. "Shortly after 8 this morning, I left Baker Street, disguised as an unemployed groom, a convincing disguise. I am pleased you think so. You deceived me entirely. Then I was safe from everyone else." The pipe glowed softly as he spoke. "My first destination was Briony Lodge, the residence of Irene Adler." "Precisely." He leaned back. "The house is charming, small, elegant, and well situated. It stands close to the road, with a garden behind, and excellent visibility from several angles." "Already planning a burglary?" Holmes laughed. "My dear Watson, I merely observe possibilities." I smiled. Experience had taught me that Holmes observed possibilities more thoroughly than most military commanders planned campaigns. "When I arrived," he continued, "I spent some time examining the property." "What did you discover?" "Several points of entry, several points of observation, and, more importantly, a nearby mews, a stable yard." "Exactly." His eyes brightened. "There is no source of information quite equal to stable hands." I could believe it. Drivers, grooms, servants, and shopkeepers often knew far more about their employers than the employers themselves suspected. I made a few acquaintances. By which you mean you bought information. A glass of beer proved sufficient. And what did you learn? Holmes tapped ash into the fireplace. That Irene Adler is extremely popular. Popular? The staple hands speak of her as though she were a queen. I found that interesting. She treats them well, apparently, and she is exceptionally beautiful. This statement carried more weight coming from Holmes than from most men. He rarely commented upon appearance. And beyond that, she lisped quietly. No parties? Very few. No suspicious visitors? One? Holmes paused. Only one. I leaned forward. A gentleman? Indeed. Who? A lawyer named Godfrey Norton. The name meant nothing to me. Apparently Holmes had expected that. He resides near the Inner Temple. And his connection to Miss Adler? That was precisely the question. Holmes rose and paced slowly before the fire. I soon learned that Norton visits frequently. How frequently? At least once a day. Good heavens. Sometimes twice. I considered the matter. Then they are close. Obviously. But in what capacity? Holmes pointed approvingly. Excellent, Watson. That was exactly my dilemma. He resumed pacing. If he were merely her lawyer, the photograph might be in his possession. And if he were something more? Then the situation changes entirely. The mystery deepened. What did you do? I watched. Of course. Observation before action. One of Holmes's favorite principles. He often repeated that premature action ruined more investigations than ignorance ever could. I had not waited long, he continued, when the situation suddenly became more interesting. How so? A cab arrived, and out sprang Mr. Godfrey Norton himself. Holmes demonstrated the scene with considerable enthusiasm. He rushed into Briony Lodge like a man pursued by destiny. I laughed. A dramatic entrance. Very. What happened next? He remained inside for approximately 30 minutes, long enough for a serious conversation. Exactly. Holmes paused. When he emerged, he appeared greatly agitated. Agitated. He checked his watch repeatedly. That sounds urgent. It was. Holmes smiled. He then shouted instructions to his cab driver. What? Instructions. Drive to Gross and Hankey's, he cried. Then to the Church of St. Monica. Half a guinea if you arrive within 20 minutes. I blinked. A church? Quite. What did it mean? At the time, I had no idea. Holmes resumed his seat. However, events moved rapidly thereafter. No sooner had Norton departed than another carriage appeared. Irene Adler? Precisely. Even in recollection, Holmes seemed impressed by her energy. She emerged from the house almost immediately. In a hurry? In an extraordinary hurry. And she instructed her driver to go to the same church. My eyebrows rose. The same church? With the same urgency, the implications became obvious. You suspected marriage, not immediately, but it crossed your mind. Briefly, he smiled. Fortunately, a cab happened to pass at that very moment, and naturally you followed. Naturally, I could almost picture it. 3 carriages racing through London, a lawyer, an opera singer, and Sherlock Holmes disguised as a stable hand. My driver performed admirably, Holmes continued, but the others arrived first. What happened when you reached the church? At this point, Holmes began laughing again. That, Watson, is where the true absurdity begins. He removed his pipe and shook his head. I entered Monica's expecting observation. Instead, I became part of the ceremony. For several seconds, I simply stared. You, what? Holmes laughed harder. I became part of the wedding. You cannot be serious. I assure you I am. He finally regained control of himself. The church was nearly empty. Only Norton and Irene and a clergyman. I waited. Norton immediately spotted me. Recognized you? No. Then why approach? Because he desperately required a witness. The truth struck me instantly. Good heavens. Exactly. Holmes pointed triumphantly. The clergyman refused to proceed without one, and you arrived at the perfect moment, or the worst, depending upon one's perspective. I burst out laughing. Even Holmes joined in. I scarcely understood what was happening, he said. Before I knew it, I was standing beside the altar, acting as witness to the marriage of Irene Adler and Godfrey Norton. The image was delightful. The world's greatest detective, accidentally serving as best man. What did you do? What choice had I? None, I suppose. Precisely. Holmes shook his head. Muttered responses. Signed. Where instructed. Exactly. And the marriage proceeded. It did. For a moment the room filled with comfortable laughter. Then Holmes grew thoughtful. Though amusing, the development complicated matters considerably. Because she was now married, yes. He leaned forward. The photograph had become more dangerous than ever. How so? If Irene loved her husband, she would not wish the photograph seen. True. But if she feared the king's influence, she might still keep it. Exactly. The situation had become far more complicated. What happened after the ceremony? The couple left separately. Separately? Quite. Interesting. Holmes nodded. Very. He recalled Irene's final words. I shall be home at 5 for my usual drive. And then I returned to Baker Street. With a plan? At this question, Holmes smiled. A slow, confident smile I had learned to recognize. Yes, Watson. A very good plan. The look in his eyes suggested that the evening ahead would be eventful. Possibly dangerous. Certainly unconventional. What do you require of me? Holmes rose and walked toward the window. Outside, dusk had begun settling over London. Gas lamps flickered to life one by one. The city seemed calm, peaceful. Yet somewhere across London, Irene Adler sat in Briony Lodge, completely unaware that Sherlock Holmes was preparing his next move. And before the night ended, and move would bring us both to her doorstep. Doctor, Holmes said quietly, turning back toward me, I shall need your assistance. Name it. In 2 hours, we go to John's Wood. His eyes gleamed. And if all proceeds as planned, before midnight, I shall know exactly where Irene Adler keeps the photograph. The game, it seemed, was entering its most dangerous stage. The afternoon shadows lengthened across Baker Street as Holmes outlined his plan. I listened carefully, though I confess that parts of it seemed unusually theatrical, even for him. That was often the case with Holmes's investigations. His methods frequently appeared bizarre first glance. Only later did their brilliance become apparent. He crossed the room and retrieved a small cylindrical object from a drawer. It resembled a cigar, at least superficially. What is that? I asked. A smoke rocket. I examined it curiously. It looks harmless. It is. Holmes handed it to me. Fortunately, harmlessness is precisely what we require. I turned the object over in my hands. You intend to use this? I intend for you to use it. That immediately made me suspicious. Whenever Holmes entrusted me with a simple task, it usually concealed considerable complexity. What exactly must I do? He sat opposite me and began explaining. The instructions were straightforward. We would travel to Briony Lodge shortly before 7 o'clock. Holmes would set certain events in motion. I was not to interfere, regardless of what occurred. That point he emphasized repeatedly. No matter what happens, Watson, I understand. Even if the situation appears alarming, very well. Especially if it appears alarming, I laughed. That sounds reassuring. It should. He pointed toward the smoke rocket. When I give a signal, you will throw this through an open window. And then you will shout one word. A word. Fire. The simplicity of the plan surprised me. That is all? That is all? That is all? And somehow this will reveal the location of the photograph. Holmes smiled. Human nature will reveal the location of the photograph. That answer, while characteristic, explained very little. Still, experience had taught me to trust him. By 6 o'clock he disappeared into his bedroom. When he emerged 15 minutes later, an entirely different man stood before me. The transformation was astonishing. Go, Sherlock Holmes. In his place appeared a kindly middle-aged clergyman. His black hat sat neatly upon his head. A white collar framed a friendly face. His expression radiated warmth and gentle concern. Even his posture had changed. The sharp, alert energy that normally surrounded Holmes had vanished. This man seemed humble, thoughtful, almost timid. Remarkable, I said. Holmes smiled pleasantly. The smile itself belonged to the clergyman. I trust I appear harmless? Entirely. Excellent. A few minutes later, we departed Baker Street. The evening was cool and pleasant. Gas lamps glowed softly along the streets. Carriages rolled past at intervals. London possessed a peaceful beauty at that hour, particularly in the quieter residential districts. By 6:15, we arrived in Serpentine Avenue. Bryony Lodge stood exactly as Holmes had described. It was an attractive house, neither large nor ostentatious, simply elegant. The sort of residence chosen by someone with taste rather than vanity. As we strolled casually along the pavement, Holmes surveyed the surroundings. So far, so good, he murmured. I followed his gaze. Several men lingered near the corner. A few young gentlemen smoked cigars. 2 soldiers chatted with a nursemaid. A tradesman pushed a cart along the street. The scene appeared entirely ordinary. Yet I suspected many of those individuals were connected to Holmes. He had a talent for recruiting temporary assistants whenever necessary. You arranged all this? I asked quietly. He smiled. I liked to prepare. That was an understatement. We continued walking. The sky gradually darkened overhead. Windows began to glow with warm yellow light. The peaceful atmosphere seemed far removed from royal scandals and secret photographs. At last, Holmes spoke again. The photograph is almost certainly inside the house. You sound certain. I am. Why? Folded his hands behind his back. Consider the alternatives. I did. A bank? Too risky. A lawyer? Also risky. Then she keeps it herself. Exactly. Holmes nodded approvingly. People trust themselves more than they trust anyone else. Particularly, I thought, a woman who had already survived several attempts to recover it. Still, I said, the house has been searched before. Poorly searched. You know that? I know human nature. He smiled faintly. Most searches fail because people look without understanding what they seek. Before I could respond, Holmes suddenly stopped walking. There, I followed his gaze. A carriage was approaching. Its lamps gleamed in the gathering darkness. Miss Adler, Holmes said softly. The vehicle rolled to a stop outside Bryony Lodge. What happened next unfolded with extraordinary speed. One of the loafers near the corner hurried forward to open the carriage door. At precisely the same moment, another man rushed toward it from the opposite direction. Their shoulders collided. Harsh words followed, then shoving, then a punch. Within seconds, several others joined the dispute. The two soldiers, the tradesmen, the idlers. The argument exploded into a noisy street fight. I realized immediately that the entire scene had been arranged. Yet the execution was so convincing that I nearly believed it myself. In the center of the chaos stood Irene Adler. For the first time, I saw her clearly. Even now, after so many years, I remember that first impression. She possessed extraordinary poise, extraordinary beauty. Not merely physical beauty, though she certainly had that. There was intelligence in her eyes, confidence, strength. One understood instantly why powerful men remembered her. The crowd surged around her. Voices shouted. Fists flew. Then Holmes acted. The kindly clergyman rushed forward, his expression filled with concern. He appeared determined to protect the lady from the disorder. For a brief moment, he vanished into the crowd. Then came a cry, a sharp cry of pain. The clergyman staggered backward. Blood appeared upon his face, and he collapsed heavily onto the pavement. The effect was astonishing. The fighting ceased immediately. Irene Adler hurried toward him. Several bystanders crowded around. Is he injured? Poor fellow! Someone help him! Voices rose from every direction. Holmes lay motionless. The blood looked alarmingly real. For a moment, I felt genuine concern. Despite knowing it was part of the performance, Irene knelt beside him. Can he be moved? She asked. Her voice carried sincere worry. One of the men bent down. Not lift in the street, miss. Bring him inside. Very good, miss. I watched as they carefully lifted Holmes and carried him toward Bryony Lodge. The front door opened. The group disappeared inside. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Yet I felt unexpectedly uncomfortable. Perhaps because Irene Adler had shown such genuine kindness. Perhaps because Holmes had chosen a worthy opponent. Whatever the reason, I found myself hoping she would suffer no real harm from our deception. A few moments later, I moved into position beneath the sitting room window. The curtains remained open. Through the glass I could see Holmes lying upon a sofa. Several people stood around him. Among them was Irene Adler. She hovered nearby, clearly concerned for the injured clergyman. The scene looked remarkably convincing. Then Holmes raised one hand slightly, the signal. My pulse quickened. Without hesitation, I removed the smoke rocket, struck the cap, and tossed it through the open window. Fire! I shouted. The reaction was immediate. Fire! 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 The cry spread through the street like wildfire itself. Voices echoed everywhere. People began running. Smoke billowed from the room. Figures rushed in confusion. For a few moments, complete chaos reigned. Then, from inside the house, Holmes' voice rang out, a false alarm. Gradually, the shouting subsided. The crowd relaxed. Order returned. I turned and walked calmly toward the end of the street, exactly as instructed. 10 minutes later, a familiar hand slipped through my arm. Holmes, no longer injured, no longer helpless, and looking extremely pleased with himself. It worked, he said. You found it? His smile widened. Indeed I did. We disappeared into the London night, together. Behind us, Bryony Lodge stood quiet once more, but Holmes now possessed the secret he had come seeking, or so he believed, for the cleverest move of the game had not yet been made, and it would come not from Sherlock Holmes, but from Irene Adler herself. For some distance, Holmes and I walked in silence. The streets of London were quieter now. Most respectable households had settled into their evening routines. Warm light glowed behind drawn curtains, and the sounds of distant carriage wheels echoed softly through the night. Holmes's pace was brisk. There was an unmistakable spring in his step. Whenever a case progressed according to his expectations, he carried himself with a certain quiet satisfaction. At last I could contain my curiosity no longer. "Well?" I asked. Holmes glanced at me. "Well, what, Watson? You know perfectly well what." A smile touched his lips. "The photograph." "Exactly. You wish to know where it is." "Very much." Holmes laughed softly. "My dear fellow, I know precisely where it is. And tomorrow morning we shall retrieve it." I stared at him. "You sound remarkably confident." "I am remarkably confident." The answer was so characteristic of Holmes that I could not help smiling. We turned into a quieter street. Gas lamps cast long shadows across the pavement. For several moments, Holmes seemed content merely to enjoy the evening. Finally, he began to explain. "You saw everything?" "Most of it." "The fight?" "Yes." "The blood?" "Also, yes." "Good." He chuckled. "The blood was paint." "I suspected as much." "A useful little trick." Holmes removed his gloves and slipped them into his pocket. "I keep several such devices available when necessary." "Naturally. One never knows when one may need to appear gravely injured." I shook my head. Only Sherlock Holmes would consider that a perfectly reasonable statement. "What happened once they carried you inside?" He clasped his hands behind his back. "Precisely what I expected." "You mean Irene Adler?" "Exactly. She took you into the sitting room." As I hoped she would. The reasoning now seemed obvious. If Holmes could gain access to the house, he could observe its interior directly. Yet there remained a crucial piece of the puzzle. How did the fire reveal the photograph? Holmes smiled. "Human instinct. That is not much of an explanation. It is the entire explanation." Seeing my confusion, he continued. "When people believe their home's burning, they rush immediately toward whatever they value most. I considered this. Not always. Almost always." He spoke with complete certainty. "A mother reaches for her child. A banker reaches for important documents. A collector reaches for his treasures. And Irene Adler reached for the photograph." The elegance of the solution delighted me. "Of course." Holmes nodded. "The alarm created panic. The smoke made it believable. And she reacted without thinking." "Precisely." He walked another few yards before I asked the question that interested me most. "Where was it hidden?" "Behind a sliding panel." "Inside the sitting room?" "Yes." He pointed as though he could still see the room before him, just above the right-hand bell pull. I imagined the scene, the smoke filling the room, the cries of fire. Irene Adler rushing instinctively toward the one object she truly wished to protect. "You actually saw it?" "For a moment." "A photograph?" "The edge of one." Holmes smiled. "It was quite enough." I found myself admiring the simplicity of the plan. No searching, no burglary, no threats. Simply allowing the subject to reveal the answer herself. "A brilliant piece of reasoning," I said. Holmes accepted the compliment with a slight inclination of his head. "It worked well. Then the case is finished." "Practically." He sounded almost disappointed. Holmes enjoyed the chase far more than the conclusion. "When do we return?" "Tomorrow morning." "With the king?" "Yes." "Will I involve him?" Holmes shrugged. "He wishes to recover the photograph personally." "And there is no danger?" "None." His confidence appeared absolute. At the time, I shared it. We had no reason to suspect that events were already moving beyond our control. For several minutes we continued our journey toward Baker Street. The night air felt cool and pleasant. The excitement of the evening was gradually fading. Then something happened. A figure passed us on the pavement. Nothing remarkable. Slim young man wearing an overcoat. the sort of person one might encounter 100 times without noticing. As he passed, however, he turned slightly. "Good night, Mr. Sherlock Holmes." The voice was clear, polite, confident. Then the stranger continued walking. Holmes stopped immediately. So did I. We both watched the retreating figure. Within moments, he disappeared into the darkness. For several seconds, Holmes remained motionless. Then he frowned. "Curious. What is that voice? You know him?" "I am not certain." His eyes narrowed. "But I have heard it before." The response surprised me. Sherlock Holmes rarely forgot a face. He almost never forgot a voice. Yet after a few moments, he merely shrugged. "No matter. You are not going after him?" "There is no reason." The answer seemed sensible enough, and yet, as we resumed walking, I noticed that Holmes appeared thoughtful. Something about the encounter bothered him. At the time, I attached little importance to it. Years later, of course, I understood exactly why that brief greeting mattered. It was one of the cleverest moves Irene Adler ever made. But that revelation lay in the future. For now, Holmes remained convinced that he controlled the game. We arrived at Baker Street shortly afterward. Mrs. Hudson had retired for the evening. The house felt unusually quiet. Holmes immediately crossed to the telegraph forms on his desk. "You are sending a message to the king. What will it say?" He wrote quickly. "Simply that progress has been made, and that he should accompany us tomorrow at 8 o'clock sharp." I watched him seal the message. "You sound very certain of success." Holmes looked up. "I know where the photograph is." "True. The rest is merely mechanics." He stretched comfortably. The case, in his mind, was already solved. Only the formal recovery remained. Yet, as I prepared for sleep that night, I found my thoughts returning repeatedly to Irene Adler. There was something unusual about her. The king feared her. Holmes respected her. Even the staple hands admired her. Such universal impressions rarely occur by accident. I remembered the concern she had shown for the injured clergyman, the intelligence visible in her eyes, the calm confidence with which she carried herself. No ordinary adventuress inspired such reactions, nor did ordinary people survive repeated attempts by royalty to recover compromising evidence. Before retiring, I paused outside Holmes's room. Lights still glowed beneath the door. He was awake, thinking, planning tomorrow's visit, no doubt reviewing every detail one final time. I smiled to myself. By morning the photograph would be recovered. The king would be satisfied. The case will closed. At least, that is what both of us believed. Neither Holmes nor I suspected that Irene Adler had already uncovered the entire scheme. Neither of us knew that while we slept, she was making preparations of her own. And by the time the sun rose over London, the hunter would discover that he had been hunted in return. The game was not over. In truth, it was only just reaching its most unexpected turn. I slept that night beneath the familiar roof of Baker Street. The events of the evening had left me pleasantly exhausted, and I drifted into sleep, convinced that the case was effectively over. Holmes had located the photograph. The hiding place was known. The king would recover his property. By noon, I imagined, the affair would be little more than another successful entry in Holmes's growing collection of solved mysteries. How mistaken I was. The next morning dawned cool and clear. London wore its usual expression of industrious determination. The streets were already filling with workers and carriages when I joined Holmes for breakfast. He appeared relaxed, perhaps even cheerful, a sure sign that he believed victory was close at hand. We had scarcely begun our coffee when heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs. The sitting room door burst open. The king of Bohemia entered like a man pursued by his own thoughts. His face was tense with anticipation. "Well?" he demanded. "Have you succeeded?" Holmes calmly buttered a piece of toast. "I believe so." The king's eyes widened. "You know where it is?" "I do. And the photograph?" "We shall know within the hour." His Majesty released a long breath. For the first time since I had met him, genuine relief appeared upon his face. "Thank heaven." Holmes smiled slightly. "Patience, Your Majesty. Patience is difficult. I have observed that." The king managed a brief laugh. Then he began pacing the room. The contrast between the two men amused me. One was a monarch whose future seemed to hang upon the outcome of the case. The other calmly finished his breakfast. At length, Holmes rose. "I think we may proceed." Within minutes we were descending the 17 steps of Baker Street and climbing into the king's waiting carriage. The morning air felt fresh. Sunlight reflected from windows and polished brass fittings. As we rolled through London, the king repeatedly attempted to question Holmes. "What will happen?" "We shall see." "Will she resist?" "I do not think so." "Has she discovered anything?" Holmes merely smiled. The answer seemed to satisfy no one except himself. I sat quietly and watched the city pass by. Though I shared Holmes's confidence, I could not entirely suppress a feeling of unease. Something about Irene Adler continued to trouble me, not in a sinister sense. Rather, I felt that we were underestimating her. Perhaps it was simply the admiration expressed by everyone who knew her, or perhaps it was Holmes's own respect for her intelligence. Whatever the reason, I found myself wondering whether the matter would truly end as neatly as expected. At last we entered Serpentine Avenue. Briony Lodge soon appeared ahead. Almost immediately, I noticed something unusual. The front door stood open, not merely unlocked, open. The sight struck me as odd. Holmes noticed it as well. His expression sharpened slightly. The king leaned forward. "What is it?" "Perhaps nothing." Yet I knew Holmes well enough to recognize that he was suddenly alert. The carriage stopped. We descended. An elderly woman stood waiting upon the steps. Her posture was relaxed, her expression almost amused, as though she had been expecting us. The moment Holmes approached, she inclined her head. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I believe." For the first time that morning, I saw surprise flash across my friend's face. "I am Holmes." "I thought so." The woman's smile widened. "My mistress said you would likely call." A silence followed, a very small silence, but a significant one. Holmes had noticed it. So had I. The king, however, remained too anxious to appreciate its meaning. "Your mistress?" Holmes asked quietly. "Mrs. Norton." The name seemed to echo. Mrs. Norton, not Miss Adler, not Irene Adler. Norton. The elderly woman folded her hands. "She left England this morning." The king's face turned pale. "What?" "Left with her husband." Holmes became very still. "When?" 5:15 train. "Destination?" "The continent." The king made a strangled sound. For a moment he appeared utterly stunned. Then anger replaced shock. "Impossible." Woman merely shrugged. "I only know what I was told." "Did she leave anything behind?" "That depends." The king stepped forward. "The photograph?" The housekeeper regarded him curiously. "I know nothing about photographs." Holmes raised a hand. The gesture instantly restored order. "May we enter?" "Certainly." She stepped aside. We crossed the threshold. The interior of Briony Lodge looked very different from the evening before. Drawers stood open. Shelves had been emptied. Various possessions lay scattered about. It appeared as though someone had packed in great haste. The king stared around helplessly. "We are too late." "Perhaps." Holmes moved quickly through the room. His eyes examined every detail. every corner, every shadow. Then, without hesitation, he approached the bell pull, the very location he had described the previous night. He reached upward, found a concealed catch, and slid open a hidden panel. The compartment lay exposed. For a moment, none of us breathed. Then Holmes reached inside. His hand emerged holding two objects, a photograph and a sealed envelope. The king's eyes widened. The photograph? But Holmes was already studying the envelope. Across the front, written in neat handwriting, appeared the words, "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, to be opened upon arrival." The room fell silent. Holmes stared at the writing. Then, very carefully, he broke the seal. "I believe," he said quietly, "that Miss Norton has left us a message." The king looked bewildered. "A message?" "Yes." Something in Holmes's voice caught my attention. Not frustration, not irritation, curiosity. A letter contained several pages. Holmes unfolded them slowly. Then he began to read. As his eyes moved across the lines, an extraordinary expression appeared upon his face, a mixture of admiration, amusement, and reluctant respect. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes looked up. For perhaps the first time in our long friendship, I saw that he had been thoroughly and completely outmaneuvered. "Watson," he said softly, "I believe we have underestimated Irene Adler." The king stared in confusion, but Holmes already knew. The woman we had come to outwit had anticipated every move, every disguise, every trick, and the letter in his hands contained the explanation, the final move in a game she had already won. For several moments, none of us spoke. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Briony Lodge, illuminating the letter in Holmes's hand. Outside, London continued its ordinary business. Carriages rattled past, voices drifted faintly from the street, yet within that room, time seemed suspended. The king stared anxiously. I watched Holmes, and Holmes read, slowly, carefully, as though savoring every word. At last he lowered the pages. A faint smile touched his lips. Not the smile of a victor, the smile of a man who has encountered an equal. "Well?" the king demanded. "What does she say?" Holmes glanced toward me. "I think, Watson, that Mrs. Norton deserves to tell her own story." He unfolded the pages once more and began to read aloud. The voice of Irene Adler seemed almost to fill the room. Not literally, of course, yet her personality emerged so vividly from the letter that I could almost imagine her standing before us. She began by congratulating Holmes, not sarcastically, not cruelly, genuinely. She acknowledged the brilliance of the plan, the disguise, the false injury, the alarm of fire. Every element executed perfectly. Indeed, she admitted that he had deceived her completely, until the very last moment. At this point, Holmes laughed softly. "What amuses you?" I asked. "Listen," he resumed reading. According to Irene, the first hint of danger had come months earlier. Friends on the continent had warned her. Should the king ever seek professional assistance, they said, there was one man he would almost certainly employ, Sherlock Holmes, the famous consulting detective of Baker Street. The warning had remained in her memory. Thus, when an elderly clergyman appeared so conveniently during the disturbance outside Briony Lodge, suspicion began to stir, not immediately. At first she believed the disguise. Holmes inclined his head modestly at its detail, but the alarm of fire changed everything. The moment she rushed toward the hidden photograph, she realized she had acted too instinctively, too openly. And once she realized that, She began examining the situation from a different perspective. "Remarkable," Holmes murmured. The king looked irritated. "I fail to see what is remarkable." Holmes folded the letter briefly. She understood exactly what happened, and, almost immediately, the king frowned. To him, intelligence in an opponent represented inconvenience. To Holmes, it represented beauty. He returned to the letter. After the false alarm ended, Irene's suspicions deepened. The kindly clergyman suddenly seemed less convincing. Questions merged. Why had he appeared at precisely the right moment? Why had strangers filled the street? Why had the disturbance erupted so conveniently? And most importantly, why had the clergyman been so interested in her sitting room? The answers became obvious. The pieces fit together. Sherlock Holmes had found her. More importantly, he had discovered the hiding place. The king groaned. So she knew. Perfectly. Holmes sounded almost pleased. The letter continued. Irene had acted immediately. While Holmes departed Briony Lodge, believing himself successful, she hurried upstairs. There she changed clothes, not into another dress, into a man's suit, a simple walking costume, practical, unremarkable, effective. The revelation reminded me of something Holmes himself had often said: the finest disguise attracts no attention. Within minutes, she had transformed herself. Then she followed him, across London, unseen. The king stared. "She followed you?" "Apparently." Holmes' smile widened. "Very skillfully, too. I could not help admiring her." To follow Sherlock Holmes without detection was no small achievement, yet she had managed it. The letter described the pursuit with delightful calmness. She watched him return toward Baker Street. She observed him enter his residence. She confirmed beyond all doubt that the famous detective himself had conducted the investigation. And then came the moment that suddenly explained everything. The mysterious reading, the young man passing on the pavement, the familiar voice. I looked up sharply. "Good heavens!" Holmes nodded. "Exactly." The realization struck us simultaneously. A young man had not been a young man at all. It had been Irene Adler, disguised, watching, testing, mocking him just a little. "Good night, Mr. Sherlock Holmes." The memory returned vividly. The confident voice, the quick smile, the disappearing figure, all of it made sense now. The king shook his head in disbelief. "This is absurd." "No." Holmes folded the letter. "It is magnificent." There was genuine admiration in his voice. The letter resumed. Having confirmed Holmes's identity, Irene immediately sought out her husband, Godfrey Norton. Together they reviewed the situation. Their conclusion was simple. If Sherlock Holmes knew where the photograph was hidden, remaining in London would be foolish. The safest course lay elsewhere. Flight, not from fear, from prudence. The king looked satisfied. "She ran." Holmes shook his head. "No, Your Majesty." The detective's voice grew thoughtful. "She won." Silence followed. No one contradicted him, because it was true. Every move Holmes had made succeeded. He identified the hiding place. He solved the mystery. He outreasoned his opponent. Yet Irene Adler anticipated the final step. And that anticipation changed everything. The letter approached its conclusion. Its tone softened. Irene addressed the king directly. She declared that she no longer loved him. The words seemed to strike His Majesty harder than he expected, perhaps because they were true, perhaps because he had secretly hoped otherwise. She explained that she had married a man she genuinely respected, a man she genuinely loved. Godfrey Norton. Compared with that happiness, old grievances no longer mattered. She had no intention of interfering with the king's marriage, no intention of embarrassing him, no intention of exposing the photograph. The king's expression gradually relaxed. She promises this? She does. And you trust her? Holmes looked surprised by the question. Completely. Why? Because she has already won. The answer seemed obvious, once spoken. A liar gains advantage through deception. A victor gains nothing. Irene Adler no longer needed leverage. She possessed freedom, security, and the satisfaction of having defeated the greatest detective in Europe. The final paragraphs reflected that confidence. She would keep the original photograph, not as a weapon, merely as protection against future interference. Should the king ever threaten her again, she wished to possess evidence of their former relationship, nothing more, nothing less. In exchange, she left another photograph, a portrait of herself, a keepsake, almost a peace offering. Holmes finished reading, then folded the letter carefully. The room remained silent. At last the king exhaled. So it is over. Yes. The photograph will never appear? I do not believe it will. The marriage remained secure. The scandal had vanished. Everything he wanted had been achieved. Everything, that is, except victory. For victory belonged to someone else. As we prepared to leave Briony Lodge, I glanced once more around the room. It felt strangely empty now. The game was over. The players had departed. Only memories remained. Yet one question lingered in my mind. A question I suspected Holmes had already answered. So stepped outside into the bright London morning. I turned toward him. Tell me honestly. Yes, Watson. Are you disappointed? Holmes considered. And, to my surprise, he smiled. No. And somehow, I knew that he was telling the truth. For while Sherlock Holmes enjoyed winning, he valued something even more, a worthy opponent, and in Irene Adler, he had found one. For a few moments after leaving Briony Lodge, none of us spoke. The morning sun shone brightly over London. The city appeared exactly as it had the day before. Shops opened their doors. Carriages moved steadily through the streets. Pedestrians hurried about their business. To the thousands of people around us, nothing remarkable had occurred. No one knew that a royal scandal had been quietly resolved. No one knew that the future of a European marriage had rested upon a hidden photograph. And certainly no one knew that Sherlock Holmes had just suffered one of the most unusual defeats of his career. Yet as we climbed back into the king's carriage, I found that Holmes appeared unusually content, not triumphant, not disappointed, simply content. The king, meanwhile, seemed almost transformed. The anxiety that had burdened him since our first meeting had vanished. His future was secure. The threat had passed. And whatever embarrassment he felt over the outcome was greatly outweighed by relief. For several minutes the carriage rolled through London in silence. At last the king turned toward Holmes. You have rendered me a great service. Holmes inclined his head. I am pleased the matter has ended satisfactorily. Satisfactorily? The king exclaimed. It has ended perfectly. Holmes smiled faintly. I would not go quite that far. His Majesty laughed. Perhaps not from your perspective. Quite. The king studied him for a moment. I believe you are the first man I have ever met who can lose a contest and still seem pleased about it. Holmes gazed out the window. The contest was worth losing. The answer puzzled the king. It did not puzzle me. I understood exactly what he meant. Throughout our years together, I had seen Holmes face criminals, scholars, noblemen, swindlers, spies, and murderers. Most were outmatched almost immediately. Their mistakes became visible to him within minutes. Their plans unraveled, their secrets emerged. Yet Irene Adler had done something very few people ever accomplished. She had surprised him. The carriage continued toward Baker Street. After a time, the king reached into his pocket. "You must allow me to reward you." "There is no need." "I insist." The king removed a magnificent ring. Even in the sunlight it seemed to burn with green fire, a large emerald surrounded by exquisite craftsmanship. It was clearly worth a fortune. "Please accept this." Holmes glanced at it briefly, then shook his head. "No, thank you." The king stared. Most men would have accepted instantly. Some might have fainted from excitement. Holmes appeared no more interested than if he had been offered a paperweight. "You refuse?" "I do." His Majesty seemed genuinely bewildered. "Then name your reward." Holmes considered. "There is something I would like. Anything." "The photograph." The king blinked. "The photograph, not the compromising one." Realization dawned. "Ah, the portrait she left behind." For several seconds, the king simply stared. Then he laughed. A deep, genuine laugh. "Of all the rewards I expected you to request, that was not among them." Holmes smiled. "It is sufficient." The king handed him the photograph. Holmes accepted it carefully, not as a treasure, not as a romantic keepsake, but as something else entirely, a reminder, a token of respect. The carriage soon arrived at Baker Street. There, upon the pavement outside 221B, the king took his leave. Before departing, he shook Holmes's hand warmly. "You are an extraordinary man, Mr. Holmes." "So I am frequently told." "And she was an extraordinary woman." At this Holmes paused, then nodded once. "Yes." The king's carriage disappeared into London traffic. For a while Holmes and I remained standing upon the pavement. Neither of us seemed eager to break the moment. Finally, we climbed the familiar 17 steps and entered the sitting room. The adventure had ended, yet its memory lingered. Holmes crossed to the fireplace. For several minutes he stood quietly, holding Irene Adler's photograph. The room was peaceful. Sunlight filtered through the windows. The city hummed softly beyond the glass. I watched my friend thoughtfully. There was no trace of romance in his expression. Many later writers misunderstood this. They imagined that Sherlock Holmes had fallen in love. They could not have been more mistaken. Love, in the ordinary sense, played no role in the matter. What Holmes felt was something rarer. Respect, pure and uncomplicated respect. He admired excellence wherever he found it. A brilliant scientist, a gifted musician, a master craftsman, a formidable criminal, and now Irene Adler, a woman who had matched him move for move and ultimately escaped the trap he had prepared. After a time, Holmes placed the photograph carefully inside a drawer. There it would remain for many years. He closed the drawer gently, then turned toward me. "Well, Watson?" "Well, Holmes?" "A curious little adventure." "Very curious." He settled into his chair, the familiar armchair beside the fire, the chair from which so many adventures had begun. For a while neither of us spoke. The silence was comfortable, the sort of silence shared only between old friends. Eventually, Holmes reached for his violin, a sure sign that his mind had already begun moving toward new problems, new mysteries, new cases. The bow touched the strings. Soft music filled the room, and as I listened, I found myself reflecting upon everything that had occurred: the disguised king, the hidden photograph, the hurried wedding, the false fire, the clever escape, and above all, the remarkable woman at the center of it all. Years later, after many adventures and many dangers, I would still remember her, not because she was the most beautiful woman we encountered, though many believed she was, Not because she defeated Sherlock Holmes, though few ever managed such a feat, and not because she altered the course of a kingdom, though in some small way she did. I remembered her because she revealed something important about Holmes himself. People often saw only his intellect, his deductions, his cold precision. They imagined him incapable of admiration, incapable of recognizing greatness in others. Irene Adler proved otherwise, for whenever her name arose in conversation, Holmes's voice carried a subtle note of respect, a respect he granted very few people. He never called her Irene, never Mrs. Norton, never Adler. To Sherlock Holmes, she remained something unique, something singular, something unforgettable. She was simply the woman, and thus ended the curious affair that threatened the kingdom of Bohemia, a case in which a king sought help, a detective solved the mystery, and a clever woman quietly won the game. The fire burned low, the violin continued its gentle melody. London carried on beyond the windows of Baker Street, and somewhere far across the channel, Irene Adler and her husband began a new life together, free at last from kings, scandals, and hidden photographs. As for Sherlock Holmes, new mysteries already awaited him. But whenever he opened that drawer and glimpsed the photograph within, I suspect he remembered this adventure with a small smile, not because he had won, but because, on one memorable occasion, he had encountered an opponent worthy of being remembered. And that, perhaps, was the greatest compliment Sherlock Holmes could ever give.